Hi, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by one of our columnists, Alejandra Oliva, who recently wrote a piece for the magazine called Love is Revision. So we are going to be talking about revising, writing, and relationships. But first, Alejandra, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, John. Thank you so much for having me. I am a writer and an immigration advocate. I live in Chicago. I'm finishing work on my first book, as you might know if you read the column, but that's coming out in June. So also doing a lot of work around that right now.
Awesome. Well, excited to hear a little bit more about the book in a few minutes. But this article, Love is Revision, talk a lot about revising and editing, both in the context of writing your book and also in your marriage and in relationships. And so most of us are in relationships, but I think most of us have not written a book. So could you tell us a little bit about what that revision process is like for you as an author?
Yeah, so I know that different people work different ways, but the way that I kind of wrote this book was sort of as an ongoing process of revision. Like every time I would add something, I would kind of go back and like make sure that what I had added was right and like sort of integrate it and then go back and fidget with some other things. And so the whole process of like moving forward and writing like a complete book was one also of like going back and constantly reading over different things or putting things in a different order and making sure that everything still fit together as a whole. And then there comes a point where you are sending it to an editor, a publishing house has it. They're like, we like this, we like the structure, we like the general thing you have here. But there are these scenes that aren't working, or there's these little pieces that aren't working. And you're like, oh my God, but I wrote this whole book and it took me many years to do. And now you want me to what? And it feels really sometimes like scary and a little destabilizing to be like, okay, but this whole argument is built around this little bit or something. And if an editor is telling you that it doesn't work or asking you questions about it, like they're probably right. They do this a lot, it's their whole job. And so having to go back in and re-examine things is, first of all, looking at things that a different version of you wrote. I recently also like fact checked the whole book myself, and because I had done a very bad job of like keeping track of my sources as I was writing, which don't recommend if you're writing a book. And the thing, it felt like I was justifying things that I had like pulled out of my head like 2 years ago sometimes that I like knew that I had gotten from somewhere that I had read from a source, but then it's like going back and being like, oh, where did that come from? A great question. And so oftentimes it's like confronting a previous version of yourself and even rereading it more recently. There's already things that I was like, oh, I don't know if I would say this way anymore. Um, and it's just a book in itself is so long and you can't usually read it in one sitting. And so it is by nature like both returning to this same piece of writing, the same work, and then also returning to a different version of the work every time or a different part of the work. And so it's both often the same work, but then always different work.
Yeah, wow. And on these last few points you made really are where in the article you make a connection to marriage and your own marriage. And I think the same would apply to other important relationships that we are in. But you say in the article that marriage is not only an ongoing story, but a daily return to the same story with the opportunity to revise. I'm curious how you've seen those parallels in your own life. What is it like to revise a relationship that you're in?
Yeah, so I feel like often when we're talking about like love stories or relationship stories, love stories imagined as broadly as possible. A big way that we get these are in like the romantic comedy or the romantic drama, where it's sort of like these two people, and then we're sort of charting their path to getting together or to the altar. And then it's sort of like, and credits roll. That's the end. Like that's the part that matters. But I think that when you're editing or when you're revising, you are making the work better. Usually that doesn't look like taking out bad parts. You're just taking out parts that don't serve the rest of the work or aren't saying what you want them to say. And so when I talk about like revision as part of a relationship or as like a relationship structure, and this again kind of goes back to Kiese Laymon's initial quote, and I think he has like a couple essays about this. It's this idea of going back and trying to make it right and trying to make it better, not because you're dissatisfied with it, but because you know it can be better and reflect a better version of you and who you want to be in the world, and a better version of your relationship, and to pull away the things that aren't serving that, whether they're things that you do and habits you have, or ways of approaching the other person, or yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Wow. And hard work, hard work. I'm sure writing a book, and also I know being in a relationship. Okay, finally, I loved another thing you said about marriage, or your own marriage, in this article. You said that at one point you realized, I'll just read the quote, the relationship we were building with each other was actually a relationship we were building together with the world. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that thought.
Yeah, so I think that weddings are particularly good at illustrating this, because the whole idea is to bring all these people that you love, under one roof into one place to sort of witness that relationship. And that is kind of true when you are doing like the vows portion of the day, when you're both standing there and everyone's looking at you, and you're sort of like, the energy is very much like going in one direction in that room. But I think it really like comes to life during wedding receptions, where everyone's talking, like suddenly like your aunt is talking to your college friend, or all these different people are meeting and mingling for the first time, and you're like, oh, this is what it means to me to be a part of a community. And that can change a lot. Like, I'm not from the Chicago area, but my partner is. And so meeting all of his family and having all of his, especially like close family members, were the ones who ended up coming. I have family from out of the country, from different states. And so that got a little complicated with having people, like asking people to get on planes and travel internationally to come party in my basement was a bit of a big ask. But it just showed that we were making relationships together with all these other people, and that all these other people were trying to make relationships with each other, with us, and had shown up not to support either of us individually, but to support the idea of us together. And like watching the way that people who had been my friends for a really long time interacted with my husband, and the way that I interact with his friends, just was like, oh, this is not about each of us individually, it's about us together. And like, we still have individual relationships with a lot of these people, and like aren't always like joined at the hip, but I think like at things like weddings, you really get to see the ways that being married, that being in a long-term committed relationship looks like being part of something that is bigger than you, that is sort of facing to the world together as one unit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I can relate. Well, thanks so much for chatting about this article. For those out there who didn't get a chance to read it yet, below in the video description, there will be a link to the article, Love is Revision. Also, there will be a link where you can pre-order Alejandra's book. It's coming out soon. You can pre-order it now. You want to just tell us a tiny bit about the book before we say goodbye?
Yeah, so the book is called Rivermouth, A Chronicle of Language, Faith, and Migration, and it is about my work in the immigration rights movement as a translator and advocate, and just kind of how that intersects with my family's story, who came to this country sort of as wealthy immigrants, and how that's really different from a lot of the ways that other people are treated as they're coming in, and the different ways that rights and laws apply to folks, and also the ways that language is one of those things that can help us bridge that.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being here and chatting, and let's do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.